What's going on, everybody? This is going to be part 2 of our video series for the Jericho 3.0 software update. If you're just coming across this video as a wholesaler or an investor, stick around till the end of this video, as I believe this video will provide a tremendous amount of value for you. And for those of you who have already acquired the Jericho 3.0, then this is going to be a full tutorial of our next discussion for automatically underwriting LOIs for cash, subject to, hybrid, and seller finance. So let's begin because we have a lot to discuss. I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible because I don't want to confuse anybody here. Let's begin at the top left-hand portion of our screen at row 2. On row 2, we have some input variables here, and these input variables are going to be important for creating the LOI as well as the calculations that are needed for the auto underwriting for cash versus subject to, cash versus seller finance, and cash versus hybrid. We have 3 separate macros that are going to do all the math for you. So if you are having difficulty underwriting properties, then this software is going to be super helpful for you, especially those who are investors and have been doing this for a long time. You're going to be able to auto underwrite hundreds of properties within a couple of minutes. So we have a macro here highlighted in orange. When you click on this macro, it's going to auto underwrite a specified property for subject to, and it's going to auto underwrite for cash versus subject to transactions. We have another macro dedicated for cash versus seller finance, and another macro dedicated for cash versus hybrid LOIs. These macros are looking at column J. Column J is our category. The property itself that you're inputting here on this spreadsheet, it is looking at the list price and the mortgage amount, in this case, the encumbrance that's associated with the property, and it's going to classify that property as seller finance, sub to, or hybrid. So that is how the macros are designating and working with the data spreadsheet listed here. It's basically going to be looking at column J, and then from column J, depending on the category of the property, it's going to perform the mathematics according to the specified acquisition type. Let's go back to row 2. This is a mouthful, so I'm going to go as slow as possible. For row 2, this is going to be our input data tabs. Input data cells, I should say. Input data cells. We're going to have the agent or seller's name, the days on market, the agent or seller's email address, their telephone number, address, the state of which the property is located in, the current list price, the mortgage amount, and the rent value. I don't need a single variable more than this. This is all that is needed to auto-generate your LOIs with all the mathematics done for cash versus subject to, cash versus seller finance, and cash versus hybrid. There is no other software in the public domain space as of right now. This is the only software that needs 3 crucial data points. Only 3. Current list price, mortgage amount, and rent value to calculate automatically the mathematics for that property for creative finance and cash. Only 3 input variables needed. Now remember from part 1, the current list price and the mortgage amount can be imported onto this particular spreadsheet by using the macros here on your screen. So remember that this is a possibility that you can do with the Jericho software. You can import your data as a CSV file. If you go back to part 1, you'll see in part 1 that it had categorized and had imported the data from PropStream according to the data points that you had selected. And the data points that we really need from PropStream are only these. These are the only data points that we really need from PropStream. So that would include the agent or seller's name on PropStream, the days on market, which is also available on PropStream. You can find this on Zillow as well. The agent or seller's email address, telephone number, address of the property, the state, current list price is also available on PropStream, but also you could find it on Zillow if you're working on market. If you're working off market, then instead of using current list price, you're going to use current market value. If you don't know how to calculate current market value, you're basically be looking at the comps in the area and then looking at the condition of the property and just trying to get a solid estimate of what you think the property's current market value is off market. Sometimes on Zillow, if you type in the address of the property, it'll give you an estimate of the off market value, but I highly suggest that you comp it out yourself if you're working off market. The mortgage amount you'll find on PropStream. The rent value, you can find that on PropStream, but it is preferable that you pull this from the Zillow rental manager, or you can go to the Zillow website of the property address that you're working with. And I believe at the bottom of the page of Zillow, it'll have a tab there that says market value of the property. It'll tell you the last sales price, and it'll also tell you the estimated rent value. You can just put in the estimated rent value. You can be pessimistic with these rent values if you choose. You have the option to be pessimistic. You have the option to be average rent values, or you have the option to input the highest rent value possible for that property. You can structure your rent values according to how you like to do your mathematics. Me personally, I like to be pessimistic, especially when I'm doing dispositions with buyers, because buyers will always come back to you and say that the rent value may or may not work in that particular area, or maybe the rent value is outdated. So a good rule of thumb is to just be pessimistic or just use the average rent value. Don't try to overestimate rent values. We can also see here that we have a deal type breakdown. What is this indicating? It's telling you that of the properties that are listed here in the lead generation autosave, it's basically looking to see how many properties are for subject to, for seller finance, for hybrid, and total number of leads. Pretty self-explanatory. It's a nice little visualization to know how far along you are with your spreadsheet that's being autosaved. Now let's go back to row 2. I know I keep saying let's go back to row 2, but row 2 is your input tabs. So what do I mean by this? It means every time I put a variable in here, let's just go with, I don't know, Jason. Jason's name is going to be copied and pasted over to the next available row in the lead generation autosave. So you can see here that Jason's name was copied and pasted into row 17. If I put in just, I don't know, Amy with a capital M, Amy's name is going to get copied and pasted over to row 18. So it's going to the next available row. This just makes it easier when you're doing, when you're working with a lot of data. You don't have to scroll on down and find the next available row, especially when you have hundreds of properties on here. It would just be a waste of time. It wouldn't be practical. So any type of manual inputs that you want to do, just manually input it here in row 2. It'll copy and paste the value into the next available row down below. So whatever cell is open, it's just going to copy and paste that variable into the next cell. And it's going to do that straight across. So columns A through I, that is what's going to happen. Okay, so it's going to be super straightforward. For off market, I want to mention that if you're working off market, it's important that you put in the days on market is 120. The reason being the days on market is important is because when we're sending out LOIs for properties for seller finance and hybrid, we're going to do the mathematics a little bit different than how everybody else is doing their mathematics. I really don't like how a lot of wholesalers and investors are looking at the current list price and basing their values or their calculations, their underwriting based off of the current list price as opposed to the current market value. But that's not enough. You have to take it an extra step further. The step further would be, how many days on market is it? Now, typically when you're working off market and you try to bring that property back onto the on-market arena, in today's market environment with 7% interest rates, that property is going to be sitting on the MLS with an agent between 90 and 120 days. So that's what the 120 days is in reference to. If the seller were to do nothing to the property, hire an agent, put it on the MLS, how long would it take for them to sell the property? When you're working off market, you're giving them a quick offer on the spot, right? It's typically cash. Sometimes you'll give them creative finance as well. But we want to base the current market value of that off-market property off of 120 days, because you're doing them a favor. You're doing a favor to the seller by buying the property now in its off-market state, as opposed to hiring an agent and then having it sit for 120 days on the MLS. So we're going to manipulate the market value of that property when it's in an off-market state, and we're going to manipulate that market value as if it were sitting on the MLS for 120 days. That's what we're doing here. And the days on market is also going to be highly important for any type of on-market properties that you're doing. Typically, when I'm working the on-market database with agents, I'm very strict with them and I'm very direct with them. And I tell them, why hasn't this property sold yet? You've been on the market for 200 something days. What's going on? And I want to include the days on market, because for every 30 days that passes on by and you haven't sold that property as an agent, whatever that list price is, it's getting 100% deducted by a certain set value, because you're probably overpriced. If your property is sitting on the MLS for 90, 120 days, 150 days on the MLS, and you haven't sold it yet, Houston, we have a problem. So the days on market is very important. And so we're going to include that in the mathematics when calculating your hybrid and seller finance. So please include the days on market, because it's going to help you out in the acquisitions, especially with the dispositions as well, because when you're working with end buyers, the end buyers are going to be looking at comps. And if you can acquire this property on creative finance terms below market value on creative finance terms, you have a huge win. So let's keep on going through the tab. I know I said a lot. Let's move on over to, the starting row. The starting row is going to be very important. So what is starting row? Starting row here is going to be starting row 13. Now the starting row 13 is indicating the row here in the lead generation autosave. Now what this row number is connected to the macros for subject to, for seller finance, and for hybrid LOI underwriting. What you're telling the macro in the background is you're saying to the macro, I want you to start at row 13, and depending on the category type of the property, I want you to underwrite all of the properties for that particular category. So in this example, we have 2 properties here for subject to, and I'm going to do a live demonstration of how that works. So I'm going to make sure that there's no LOIs here that have been created before for subject to. I think I have something open here. I'm going to close out of it real quick. We'll minimize it. We'll minimize this. This is going to be the designated folder path. Remember, in part 1, we're going to have a designated folder path. So we go over to the master tab, blast emails, this folder path in column I2. This is going to be your designated folder path for all LOIs generated for cash and creative finance. You'll have a second folder path for dispositions, but you're going to have one primary folder path to hold all of the underwriting that was done for that property. So this is my folder path. I have this sitting on the desktop. I just named it as Excel Creative LOIs. When I minimize this, I'm going to delete this file here because this one's already been done before, and I want to do a live demonstration with you guys. When I click on this orange button here, the macro, it's going to auto underwrite the property, and then it's going to deposit that LOI. It's going to save it, I should say. It's going to save the LOI, and it's going to save it to this folder. So let's do that. We're going to start at row 13. There's 2 LOIs here. So I'm going to click on the orange macro. and it's complete. We see here that we have a message box, and the message box says sub 2 LOIs completed. So we have 2 properties auto underwritten within seconds. This was done within seconds, not minutes. So imagine having to imagine having to manually underwrite 3 to 5 properties. If you have to manually underwrite 3 to 5 properties, you're probably going to be sitting in front of your calculator here for maybe 3 minutes. On average, I would say about 3 minutes for each particular property. We have a ton of time here being saved by having this being done automatically for you. So if I click on one of these LOIs, this is just a sample template that everyone's going to be receiving through the Jericho software. You can use this template. You can manipulate this template as you want. The templates are located here at the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. You'll have a sub 2, you'll have a hybrid, and then you'll have a seller finance template here on my mouse cursor. You can see that down below. We'll do a separate video on the templates, but these templates are customizable. You can edit the text however you like. The only thing that's not customizable is what's highlighted in yellow. What's highlighted in yellow, the VBA macros that are working in the background, it is specifically working with the designated cell. So if you start messing with the row column or the row count, you're going to run into issues because the VBA macros are designated to, let's say, row 4 of column B, for example, or column J, row 6 would be another example. So it's designated to certain cells. So whatever is highlighted in yellow, highly suggest you don't manipulate the row or the column. What is manipulative is the text itself. You can put in your own logo. You can add your own credibility, add any HUDs that you've closed on the properties to show to the seller, hey, I'm a reputable buyer. Here are properties that I've closed on. What's highlighted in yellow, don't touch. But in the next video for the sub 2 hybrid and seller finance, we'll go into greater extent of what the template looks like. But for right now, I will just say verbally that what is highlighted in yellow, you can easily change the background color to white. That way you're not sending out yellow text boxes to your seller. So be sure to fix that. This is just for visualization purpose so that you know when you acquire the Jericho system what cells are not good for editing. So let's minimize this. Let's minimize our folder path as well. So we just went over the macro. The macro here is for sub 2. And now we've got a couple of information here regarding the sub 2, as well as some general information here that we're going to look at as well. So the general information would be the conventional sales fee and the creative sales fee. I've talked about this multiple times on the YouTube channel here, but what the conventional sales fee and the creative sales fee is the closing cost for that property. Typically, your creative finance deals are going to cost less to close on than a cash offer. Why is a creative deal going to cost the seller less money at closing? Because let's say, for example, the buyer takes the property over subject to, or it's a hybrid transaction. There's not going to be a loan payoff associated with the property encumbrance because you're not paying off the mortgage. There's not going to be any miscellaneous added fees for, closing on the mortgage with the lender early. You're just going to take over the payments, right? So you're going to save money on there. You're going to save money on title insurance, typically for creative finance too, depending on who the attorney is. You'll also save money on the attorney fees as well, because there's an associated risk involved with subject to, seller finance, and hybrid, and typically attorneys. They will close on the property and they won't really charge you all that much for the closing costs, depending on who you're working with. There's some attorneys out there that will charge you a lot of money to close on a creative transaction. But I'd say on average, I think most attorneys understand that it is an untraditional closing, and so they're willing to give you an untraditional closing cost fee, just because of the nature of the transaction, right? So for cash offers or conventional offers that the seller receives, typically best case scenario is a 3.5% closing cost fee. What does this encompass? It encompasses all of the closing costs associated with a title transfer, the attorney fees, deed transfer, everything that's miscellaneous when it comes to closing costs. You're typically looking at about 1% for closing cost fees, plus the 2.5% for a best case scenario agent commission. That is where the 3.5 is coming from. 2.5 to the listing agent, 1% towards closing costs equals 3.5%. So when we're looking at sending out offers for LOIs to the seller, we want to look at the best case scenario. Never look at the worst case scenario, because you want to show to the seller, hey, on a creative transaction, I can outcompete the net closing amount that you will receive on a creative transaction as opposed to a cash or conventional. And this is especially prevalent in subject to transactions. In subject to transactions, you'll see this a lot. You're able to offer the seller more money at closing in compensation to taking the property over subject to. And so the seller will walk away with more money at closing just because you are forcing some extra equity on the property, meaning maybe it's listed at $300,000 and you're going to pay them maybe $310,000 for it. So you're giving them an extra $10,000 over asking price because you know that you're getting this property at, let's say, a 3.5% interest rate. And so you're okay with giving them an extra $10,000 in their pocket because you want to incentivize the seller to take my creative offer as opposed to cash or conventional offers. So that's a lot to be said. But the 3.5%, this is towards conventional. 3.2 is towards creative. It's about 0.8% of the list price. If you're working off market, it'll be about 0.8% of the market value of that property. These are closing cost fees. 2.5% towards the agent commission, best case scenario. A lot of agents want 3 or 3.5%. You can manipulate this if you want. Let's say you have a conversation with the agent and they tell you that their commission is 5%. Then change this value from a 3.5%. You change this over to a 5% commission plus the 1% towards closing costs. Now this changes to a 6% as your variable input. But that only happens after you have a conversation with the agent. When we're sending out these offers for LOIs on a massive scale to these sellers, you want to look at the best case scenario because you are trying to incentivize the seller to not only pay attention to your professional looking LOI, which no seller will ever receive an LOI like this through the Jericho software, but you're trying to incentivize them on the mathematics as well, right? That's the whole point of doing an email blast with sellers with, offers for cash or creative finance. We're incentivize them. Who is a motivated seller to take your cash or creative finance offer? So that's a lot to be said. A lot more can be said in follow-up videos, but this is a good explanation as to what the conventional versus creative sale fees are. For subject to offers that are for cash, what is this? The cash versus subject to offer, in most cases, unless you're working with a hedge fund, in most cases, this cash offer is a bluff cash offer. Now, why are we giving a bluff cash offer to the seller? Is that unethical? Technically not, because we're not under contract right now. We're just trying to incentivize the seller. If I gave you 90% cash based off of your current market value, you're more than likely going to have to bring money to closing under a subject to transaction. And that typically could mean that the seller has to bring between $15,000 to $20,000 at closing because they simply don't have equity on the property. So when we're sending out subject to offers, we're doing we have the intentions of showing the seller this is what it looks like at cash versus conventional at 90% market value, where you have to bring money to closing. this is what it looks like on creative finance, where I can offer you more money for the property and you're actually going to net something at closing. So the cash percentage for subject to offer, this is what I call a bluff cash offer. You have a conversation with the agent and saying, oh, is this cash offer, is this cash offer reputable? Can you come up on the cash offer? This is when you would have a conversation with the seller or with the agent, and the conversation could go one of two ways. You could be honest with them and tell them, look, we're not really interested in purchasing your property via cash right now. We just wanted to give you a demonstration of if I paid you 90% cash, which typically would never happen because most cash buyers are at 60 to 70% ARV. But if I were to pay you 90% cash, you'd still have to bring money to closing. Or your second option is, I'm going to review the numbers. I'm going to look at my underwriting. You are going to look at the underwriting. Don't say you're going to send this out to an underwriting department because there's no need for that. Just say that you as the buyer are going to be looking at the underwriting. You're going to see if it makes sense for you to come up on cash. You're going to see if it makes sense for you as a cash offer to begin with. And then you just have a follow-up conversation with the seller or the agent. And you just tell them and explain to them, this cash offer that was presented to you, we looked at it again. We had another runaround. We looked at the rent. We looked at the location. We don't really feel comfortable with giving our cash offer, but we would be comfortable with our creative finance offer. Did you have any questions about option number 2 that is being presented to you? What can I do to clarify the subject to transaction? Oh, and by the way, I see that you're listed at $330, but I'd probably be willing to pay you $340 for the property. So this is where you start to have a conversation with the seller and with the agent. So this is like, I wouldn't say this is a game of poker, but in many ways you need to be strategic with how you're talking with sellers and agents. So bottom line is, for the subject to offers, is the cash offer, the 90%. This is a bluff cash offer unless you're working with a hedge fund who's willing to offer more for cash. Then you're more than welcome to change this from a 90% to, let's say, 95%. I typically stay at 92% of whatever the list price is. So this 90% is based off of the list price, not the market value. And then we also have the average assignment fee. We're just going to put in average assignment fee of $15,000. If you are a wholesaler and you are assigning the deal, you just put in your average assignment fee here. And this number is going to be valuable because this number here is associated with the cash on cash percentage for the property. And that's going to be very handy when we're working with seller finance and the hybrid acquisition. So this is all for subject to. So a lot has been said right now for subject to. So if you don't understand something, leave a comment in the video description below, or rewind this video and just have another look at it. But now we're going to move into our seller finance portion of the auto underwriting for the Jericho system. So what is a seller finance? This is very unique. You will not find this anywhere else on YouTube. There is no software available in the public domain that does what I'm about to show you now. So if you made it this far in this video, congrats, because this is going to be super beneficial to you. Now, for seller finance, our cash offers can be between 60 and 80% of whatever it's currently listed at, depending on the amount of work that is needed for the property. But I like to stay at 70% of the list price. Why? Because it gives me enough wiggle room here to renegotiate with the seller if I need to. Let's say I'm deciding to wholesale this property to an end buyer, and they need to be a little bit less on the list price. Even though I gave them 70% cash on the list price, let's say the end buyer needs to be at 68% of the list price. Then I can go back to the seller, renegotiate my cash offer, so I'm at 65% of the list price. That way I've got a spread there for my assignment fee. The cash offers for seller finance are real cash offers, because these are cash offers that you can work with either taking down the property yourself as an investor or assigning the deal to an end buyer. So these are real cash offers. These are not bluff cash offers. You should not be bluffing anything with a cash offer. You should have the intentions of giving a cash offer that you know you would buy yourself, or a cash offer on a property of which you can make an assignment fee off of and assign that deal, that property, to the end buyer. I like to stay at 70%. You can go all the way up to 80%, but I typically wouldn't do that. I'd say the max is maybe about 75% of the list price. If you're working off market, then don't go past 75% of the market value. This is going to give you room to renegotiate with the seller if you need to. Now, what is the down payment of seller finance offers? This is the down payment that the seller is going to receive at closing. So all seller finance and all hybrid acquisition types, the seller is going to receive a non-refundable down payment at closing. So that's going to be 10% of the list price, or 10% of the market value of the property. So if the property is listed at $300,000, then they're going to get $30,000 at closing. Now, I typically don't like to go past 12.5%. Actually, no, I changed that. I don't like to go past 13%. I'm okay with 12.9% of the down payment because it's just a couple $1,000s. So I don't go past 13% of the list price. The target cash on cash percentage, super important. This is going to be super important when you are signing the deal to an investor, or you are the investor and you're using this software to get an approximation of what your expected cash on cash percentage is going to be for that property. I can calculate the cash on cash percentage automatically for these properties off of 3 variable inputs: current list price, mortgage amount, and rent value. I can do that. No other software available in the public domain can do that just based off of 3 input variables. But the mathematics here that's been incorporated in the Jericho system has been tweaked to the point where you can calculate your properties for cash or creative finance with a lot of confidence that if you need to manually underwrite after the seller has accepted your general LOI that was sent to them, which you should always do, your manual underwriting will not be that far off from the auto underwriting because the mathematics are super close. And that's actually a good point to make right now too, while we're at it. After you have sent out your auto underwriting LOIs to your sellers or agents, and the seller or agent comes back to you and says, hey, we're interested in this cash offer, or we're interested in this creative finance offer. Once you have an acceptance of them wanting to move forward, this is the point in time when you now manually underwrite on the property. Do not spend many hours underwriting on a property when you have no idea if the seller is going to even accept your cash or creative finance offer. It doesn't make any sense to spend all this time up front. You're looking for motivation. Who's motivated to take a cash offer? Who's motivated to take a creative finance offer? Depending on the motivation, and they accept your initial LOI that was sent to them, now you have a follow-up conversation with them and say, okay, I'm going to verify the underwriting here. Let me manually look at everything: taxes, insurance, the mortgage amount, rent values. You're going to then look at everything manually to verify if I need to adjust my numbers that the seller is receiving. And you'll do that under the manual underwriting after the seller has accepted your initial offer from the auto underwriting. So a lot has been said there as well. Super important. Target cash on cash percentage is super important. It's going to be needed for traditional seller finance, and it's going to be needed for reverse seller finance. That's another thing about the Jericho system. This is the first software ever in the public domain to give a reverse seller finance offer. I'll do a separate video on the YouTube channel explain what is a reverse seller finance, but you will have this option here to do a reverse seller finance. You can just click on this little input variable, click on yes. If you want to give them a regular traditional seller finance, you click no. If you want to do something more unique with the seller, you just click yes. The purchase over market value, this sell here is only for those who are doing reverse seller finance. So those of you who are doing reverse seller finance, in my upcoming videos here that you will see on the YouTube channel, I'll go into further detail of what reverse seller finance is. But what we're doing, essentially, the very basic, is we're putting a cap on how much the seller is going to receive on seller finance. Why am I doing that? Because if we keep applying interest to the principal, and we have a very long duration period of time of which the seller is holding the note for seller finance, they're going to be walking away with maybe 20 to 30% total profit over market value. What do I mean by that? If the property is $300,000 and I apply a 5% interest on it over a 5-year time period, I don't know what the math would be automatically off the top of my head, but we can assume that we're going to be overpaying for the property substantially because the note's being held for 5 years. We've got a 5% interest on the principal payment, and we're essentially going to give them extra money in the terms of interest, and that extra money that's associated as interest is going to be over market value of what the property is currently worth. And so with reverse seller finance, we're putting a cutoff. We're putting a cutoff and saying, you know, I'm willing to do seller finance with you, but this is the maximum I'm willing to pay you. The mathematics is completely unique to the Jericho software and proprietary as well. However, I will make a separate video on the reverse seller finance, which is included with the new software update for the Jericho system. So what we'll have here is we'll have two separate macros. Macro number 1 is going to calculate this maximum seller monthly payment. Macro number 2 is going to create the LOI for that property. So let's do a live demonstration. So let's go back to the rent values, because macro number 1 is highly dependent on the current rent value of that property. So right now I can see here that I've got one property with a rent value of $3,000. I'm going to change the incumbents here on the second property to 0 because I want to give you a live demonstration of the functionality of calculating monthly payments on a massive scale. So we have 3 separate rent values for 3 separate properties: $3,000 a month, $2,600 a month, $3,400 a month. We have 3 properties right now for seller finance. If we go over to column U of your workbook, you're going to then change this value to 1%. And if you don't have to change it to 1%, but just because I want you to see the incremental difference, we are now going to calculate the maximum monthly payment based off of the interest rate percentage that's going to be applied on the principal payment. So macro number 1 is going to calculate the maximum monthly payment for the seller. It's going to increase that interest rate, but it's going to do so in a way where the target cash on cash percentage is at 12.5% minimum. That is our target. So we will not give a monthly payment to the seller which super exceeds our target cash on cash percentage of 12.5. So if I go over here to the right hand side, you're going to see these 3 variables here on your screen. They're going to change, and we're going to click on the macro. And we can see here that everything has updated. We have a 6.55% interest rate, a 5.18, and a 0.59. These interest rates have now been automatically applied for that property through a single click of a button, and that single click of a button is now calculating the maximum monthly payment that the seller can receive for seller finance based off of a target cash on cash percentage to the investor of 12.5%. Now, where is the cash on cash percentage? It is listed here in column AC. Column AC is going to have your target cash on cash percentage. You can simply click on this cell, and the cell will tell you how the mathematics are being applied. All these cells will be unlocked, so if you have any questions about the mathematics at all, you can just double click on the cell and it'll show you the formula, and you can see how everything is being done. So this is maximum monthly payment for traditional seller finance. I have the option here now to do a reverse seller finance where I'm going to have a cap on the interest portion of the seller finance payment to the seller. So we'll just change this to yes. And for some reason, Excel workbook just crashed, but it's gonna come right back up. Perhaps it might just be because I'm running the screen record in the background. Perhaps my RAM was a little bit slow, but that's okay. We're back up and running here. We're going to change the reverse seller finance to no. Look at the interest rate here. We've got a 6.5, 5.18, 0.59. I am going to take a screenshot here so we know what we're working with for traditional seller finance. Or actually, let's move this over to the right-hand portion of the screen. We're going to save the workbook. We'll click on show repairs. This is just because it just closed automatically because of, I'm assuming it was because of the RAM was maybe a little bit full since we're doing a screen record, but that's okay. We're going to rerun the macro now. We're going to click on the macro. Okay, we're going to put a pause on this video here. I'm going to double check on the file. We'll be right back. I probably just need to change the setting here. I think the screen record may have messed with the functionality of the Excel spreadsheet. All right, so we're back. My RAM was running a little bit slow and had caused the Excel spreadsheet to crash. That typically is something that can happen when you're screen recording, and it uses up a lot of RAM. And I've been running these macros on the Excel spreadsheet, which also uses a lot of RAM as well. But we're going to continue on where we left off. I'm going to minimize myself here on the screen. So where we had last left off is that we had applied a traditional seller finance. So the last cell here was clicked as no. And we had these three variables here. We'll go back to the screenshot that we had before. It was a 6.5, 6.5, 5.1, 0.59. So these variables had stayed the same. What we're now going to do is we're going to do a reverse seller finance, and we're going to compare the difference between traditional seller finance and reverse seller finance. Big difference. So we're going to click this to yes. We're going to have a market cap of 10%. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to rerun the macro for reverse seller finance. The reverse seller finance is going to look at the categorized properties here in column J, and it's going to calculate the maximum monthly payment that the seller is going to receive based off of a target cash on cash of 12.5%, but we're putting a cap on the seller finance. The mathematics is going to be proprietary, so I will not be disclosing how that's calculated, but it is a first of its kind. I've already closed on 3 properties using this type of method for reverse seller finance, so there's no issues with this type of mathematics, but it is completely new to the wholesaling and investor world, and it is a huge benefit in terms of looking at the underwriting in a different perspective. And I'm going to show you that right now. So we're going to look at column U. We're going to calculate the interest portion. Once again, you can see here that the macro is running, and it says here, seller finance max monthly payment completed. And we have a 2.42, 2.49, 0.63. So we can see here that the maximum monthly payment that the seller is going to be receiving on a reverse seller finance is going to be significantly less in terms of the interest rate that's being applied. So this is reverse seller finance. This is traditional seller finance. If we minimize this and scroll on over to the right-hand portion of the screen, we can see here that our cash on cash percentage is also significantly better. And the cash on cash percentage is with the estimation that we are deducting 20% off of the rental expenses. So let's say you have rent going for $3,000 a month. You take 20% off the top, 10% towards property management, 10% towards repair reserves. That's all that's needed. Some people like to add a 5% for vacancy, but honestly, you don't need to do that. Depending on how you write your lease with your tenant. Here in New York, tenants are required to notify the landlord that you would plan on vacating the property with a 60 days notice. If the landlord cannot find a tenant within 60 days, the security deposit is not given back to them. It is held in terms of the vacancy period until the landlord is able to find a tenant for that property. So we don't typically apply vacancy rates here in New York because the way that the leases are written out, it is in favor of the landlord. 20% off the top is how we typically do the underwriting. And if we do take 20% off the top, we can see here for reverse seller finance, the cash on cash is a lot greater. So this is reverse seller finance. So this concludes everything for the seller finance portion of the calculator. Now what we can do now is take this a step further, and we can auto-create all of our seller finance leads. We should have 3 of them. So we're going to start at row 13. I'm going to click on the second macro here, which is going to create the 3 separate PDFs. So you can see here that the Excel spreadsheet says that it was loading. Seller finance LOIs is completed. If we go over to our folder, which is our designated folder, I'll just click on date modified, and we can see here that we have 3 separate properties here that have been calculated right now. 5:27 p.m., 5:27 p.m. There should be a third one. Am I missing something here? Starting row 13, 1320 Militant, 987 123 Main Street. Oh, okay, I see what happened here. We already had an LOI written out here for 123 Main Street. So it had skipped that one because the LOI was already written out. So we have 2 LOIs here that the Jericho software has implemented. This is going to be a completely different template because this is seller finance. So if I scroll down on the PDF, you can see here now that we have a payment structure that the seller is going to be receiving. This payment structure is based off of reverse seller finance, because remember that was what our last input variable was. This was for reverse seller finance. We can change this back to no, and if we change this back to no, you can see a couple of the variables here on your screen got updated, and we would just create a new PDF based off of traditional seller finance. But we can see here that the macros are working just fine. And so you'll essentially be able to calculate monthly payments for hundreds of properties for seller finance, and then create a professional looking LOI as shown here on your screen. This is a pretty good looking LOI. You can change the text, as I said before, add your credibility, add any type of HUD statements that you want, change the description of what a seller finance transaction is, your cash offer to the seller, add a logo. A lot of this is going to be functional in the sense that you can edit it to your liking. Let's move on over to the last portion here of the Auto Underwrite LOI tab. This is going to be a pretty lengthy video, but I think it's going to be super beneficial to you, the buyer, wholesaler, or the investor who is using the Jericho software. We have something here, a little footnote here. If we're calculating the monthly payment and the monthly payment is not in this, if the monthly payment that the seller is receiving doesn't work for the cash on cash percentage, these variables here will be highlighted in red. So I think before we move into the hybrid LOI, I'm going to give you a demonstration first. I want to make sure we're super clear on what I mean because I didn't explain that very well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the cash on cash target to, let's say, 10%. We're going to do reverse seller finance. I'm going to click no, and I'm going to rerun the macro here for a 10% cash. Actually, no, let's do 20%. We got to go up. Let's do a 20% target cash on cash percentage with a reverse seller finance as no, so it's traditional seller finance. And we're going to run the macro again, and we're going to see what monthly payment we're going to give the seller based off of us, the investor, receiving a 20% target cash on cash percentage. I want the interest rate here to fail because I want to show you as the user what you do in this scenario if the interest rate fails. So let's calculate the macro again. I'm not entirely sure if it'll fail, but it did. So we can see here that one of the properties here, it was impossible for it to cash flow with a 20% return. So what do you do in a scenario when you auto underwrite a property and it comes back as a 0% interest and it just simply couldn't underwrite the property based on the 20% cash on cash return? Well, super easy. We know that this is row 15. So we're going to put a break in the macro. Whenever there's a break in the macro, it will see the break and it will not move into the next available property because there's a break, there's a space. And so we're going to rerun the seller finance macro, but we're going to base this off of the failed property. So this is failed property, row 15. Row 15 is a failed property, and it did not cash flow at a 20% return. We were not able to make the mathematics work. So what do we need to do so that we can increase the monthly payment to the seller, but still have a decent return on our investment? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the sell value to 1%. So that's indicated here with the footnote. Anytime you receive a value here that is highlighted in red, change it to 1% because we're going to rerun the macro. And we're going to come back here to the target cash on cash. Let's try it for 15%. A 15% target. We're going to rerun the macro at row 15, which is going to be our starting row. And if we click on the macro, it still failed. So for some reason, we are not able to get a 15% cash on cash return, which means we have to come down even more. So let's go to maybe 12%, 12% cash on cash return. Let's change this to 1% again. Let's rerun the macro and let's see what we get. Okay, so for at traditional seller finance, we can offer the seller 0.75% interest for this particular property at the current list price, at the current rent value. This is what we can offer them in terms of interest being applied so that the investor has a return of 12% on the capital that they're putting forth on the property. And so we now can see that the macros can be manipulated to any type of cash on cash percentage. We have 20% for the first two properties, 12% for the third property. Now that we have fixed that, we're going to delete this row because we don't need this row, and that's it. And now we can move on to the remaining list that we have here for seller finance, subject to, hybrid, whatever auto underwriting that we want to perform, we can continue to do that. Just know that when you have any type of breaks within these rows here, the macro will not work because there's clearly a break within the next row that we're trying to target for underwriting. And so when it sees that break, then the macro is just going to stop at that exact spot. So just keep that in mind. And that's a good way to kind of control the macros that are being run too. So now let's take a look at the hybrid. Now for hybrid's going to be much different. For hybrid, we're going to set our cash offer for hybrid. Hybrid cash offer, we know that there's going to be an encumbrance associated with the property. And because there's an encumbrance associated with the property, our cash offer needs to be higher than what a traditional seller finance scenario might look like on cash, meaning that the seller finance property is free and clear. Hybrid, there's an encumbrance associated with the property. So we know that our cash offer needs to be higher than the encumbrance associated with the property. So our cash offers are going to be typically higher than the seller finance cash offer. So for here, we're going to stay at maybe 80 to 85% would be a pretty decent cash offer. Maybe even 75% if you want to go down as low as that. But keep in mind, our cash offers are with the intentions of either taking down the property ourselves or assigning it to an end buyer. So if at any point in time you need to renegotiate with the seller with your cash offer, you have the flexibility to do so because you did not offer them full price on cash, right? You're coming in with a cash offer but on a discount. Hybrid down payment, don't go past 10% for a hybrid down payment. If you start going past 10% on the down payment for hybrid deals, you're really pushing the mathematics for underwriting. I've seen people go up to 15% down on hybrid. I really don't recommend you doing that. Maybe you can still stay at the same amount for sub 2 at 12% down, max. But I personally don't like to do that. I personally like to stay between 9 and 10% for our down payment on hybrid because with the LOIs that are being written for the Jericho software, what we're doing now is we're going to overpay for the property. Remember, we're trying to incentivize the seller to take a creative offer, not a cash offer. We're going to overpay on the property by 7% of the current market value. So that's what this 7% is. So although the seller might receive a little bit less on the down payment, they're going to make up for it on the back end because we're offering more money for the property. Now for hybrid, I never include interest rates on hybrid. That's something that I learned along the way with underwriting a ton of properties. It just doesn't look good for an end buyer or for a retail buyer or then for an investor to have a second position note with interest being applied. It's much cleaner visually, psychologically for that individual who's taking down the property to take down that second note as principal only payments with no interest being applied. So what do we do in the scenario where it's only principal only payments and no interest being applied? How do we go over market value with the seller? Well, we do that by simply just offering more over the current list and ask price. So if they want $350 for the property, then I might give them, whatever 7% over would be. So let's do $350 as an example. Let's add 7% over ask price. So I'd be willing to pay $375 for the property. But as principal only payments, no interest being applied. I'm okay with that because I know that a property year over year average appreciation is going to be about 2.5%, maybe 3%, depending on the market that you're in. But average is about 2.5% year over year appreciation. So that means if I pay 7% over market value now, then that property value will increase within 3 years. Within that 3-year time period, whatever I paid for it initially will be what it's worth in 3 years. So I'm controlling how much I'm willing to pay for the property depending on the market appreciation of that property in that specific area. So that's what we're doing here on the hybrid acquisitions for the LOIs, hybrid offers, 9-10% down for a hybrid, gross rent to seller, simple calculation. This is based off of the rent value. So if we have a $3,000 rental value, 10% is going to the seller. So that'd be $300 going to the seller. This is going to be quick math. If we need to manually underwrite after they have accepted our offer, that's when we go in, check the rent values, check the property tax, check the insurance, check anything that needs to be checked where we need our numbers to be in a certain spot. But for quick underwriting, don't go past 10% of the gross rent as a monthly payment to the seller. This is specifically for hybrid acquisitions, hybrid LOIs. For the purchase over market value, don't go past 10% as well. That's a pretty good rule of thumb, even for seller finance. But that'll be a discussion for a separate video. This is a lot of information for one video here, but I think it'll be super helpful to you guys. So let's do the auto create all hybrid LOIs. I think we only have one LOI here right now. Yeah, we only have one LOI right now. It's a 987 Broadway. Let me make sure I don't have that saved. I do have that saved, so I'm going to delete that. Let's see. I think I have it open here. I have it open. So we're going to close out of the PDF. We're going to delete the file because we changed it manually here on the spreadsheet to hybrid. And we're going to run the hybrid LOI. And if we run the hybrid LOI, you can see here that we have a message box now saying hybrid LOI is completed. We'll go to our folder path destination, click on the PDF. We see here that we have the property address as an LOI, the creative total profits, cash offer, and payment structure to the seller as well. So this is all being done for you automatically through the Jericho software. All this is being done for you. This should be super helpful. It'll help you guys underwrite your property super fast. Once the LOIs have been created, what you're going to do next is you're going to take the agent's information, the agent's email address. If you're working off market, then it'll be the seller's name, the seller's email address, and then the property information. You will copy and paste the information that you want to send out to LOI. So let's say you have like 100 properties here in one column and another 100 emails, another 100 property addresses. Just copy and paste that over into the master tab here, and that'll go into its designated columns. And then in the next video, we'll do a blasting of emails. And when we blast out those emails, it's going to automatically attach the letter of intent, the professional LOI that's been generated before. It's going to automatically attach that LOI to your email that's being sent to the seller and to the agent. So everything's being automated for you. Just copy and paste the agent's name, agent's email address, the property address, copy and paste those values into here. We're doing this intentionally because I want you as the user to have full manual control of who is going to receive an email. And so this is a way of controlling that type of information that's being dispersed, where we're deciding who's going to receive an email. Because you may write an LOI for a property, but you may decide that you just don't want to send that LOI to the seller for whatever reason. So that is why we will copy and paste that information here. Once done, you'll click the blast emails. On the next video, part 3, we're going to go into full depth on the master tab and the blasting of emails. This is where the brains of the calculator is. If you thought the auto underwriting LOI had a lot of information on here and you thought this was the brains, it's not. The brains of the Jericho system here is in the master tab. But that'll be a separate video here. Thank you for watching. I hope this information was valuable to you. And we'll see you in part 3.